and welcome to Teenage Student Neuro Hurdles, a discussion about teenage mental health. I'm Dr Suzi Gage, your chair for today's panel session, and I'm joined by some of the best and most engaging neuroscientists in the land. The Cosmic Shambles Network was supposed to be presenting this event live at lots of different festivals this summer, including the Cheltenham Science Festival, Blue Dot, the Royal Institution's Summer Festival, and many others, but obviously all those plans were scuppered by COVID-19. So we thought we'd do a special live stream of the event instead. The Shambles team chose this week to do it, as it's the very week that this panel and loads of other exciting Cosmic Shambles events were supposed to be taking place in our favourite field in Suffolk for the lovely Latitude Festival. If you want to recreate that experience, grab a warm beer at your peril. A few other Shambles things to mention before I introduce our panel. Live streams like this and all the other podcasts and documentaries and other content at Cosmic Shambles are made possible by your support. If you would like to subscribe to Cosmic Shambles on Patreon, head on over to patreon.com/Cosmic Shambles. As a supporter, you'll also get access to loads of exclusive shows and bonus bits and pieces for signing up as well. On the channel tomorrow night, you'll be able to see the next episode of Genetics Shambles, presented in association with the Genetics Society and the Milner Centre for Evolution, hosted by Robin Ince. Tomorrow night's episode is a rough guide to the human genome, and Robin will be joined by Dr. Adam Rutherford, Sarah Teichmann, and Professor Gil McVeigh. Now, on to tonight's show. I'm thrilled to be joined by three of the best neuroscientists and communicators of science, who I also have the privilege of having known for many years now as friends. It's Dr. Dean Burnett, and the newly titled Professor Pete Etchells, and in all likelihood, probably one of our many feline family members at some point during this chat. So a quick intro of all of our guests. Dr. Dean Burnett is a neuroscientist, honorary research associate at Cardiff Psychology School, visiting industry fellow at Birmingham City University, and a best-selling author. His latest book is called Why Your Parents Are Driving You Up the Wall and What to Do About It. He also hosts the Brain Yapping and Smart Welsh People podcasts on the Cosmic Shambles Network. Dr Suzi Gage is a senior lecturer in psychology and epidemiology at the University of Liverpool, where she investigates associations between recreational drug use and mental health. Her first book, Say Why to Drugs, was released earlier this year, and it's based on her award-winning podcast of the same name. Professor Pete Etchells is a professor of psychology and science communication at the University of Bath, where his research focuses on understanding the short and long-term behavioural effects of playing video games. His first book, Lost in a Good Game, Why We Play Video Games and What They Can Do for Us, was released last year. All of our panelists have their own blogs as part of the Cosmic Shambles Network, which you can check out at cosmicshambles.com/blogs. And quite frankly, all of them make me feel exceptionally lazy with all the brilliant things that they do. Dean, Suzi, Pete, welcome. How are you all doing? And where are you all? Dean, let's kick off with you.
Currently okay, at an acceptable standard, which I'll take that. I'm currently in my outside office, my cabin, or my global headquarters, however you want to look at it. Basically a wooden box in my garden. I've got a fridge, so that's all I really need, and an internet connection. So potentially I'm in command of my own domain here. But yes, you may hear noises at some point. It's animals outside causing chaos and causing a lot of echoes. And people, before I put the bookshelves up, people thought I was always broadcasting from a sauna. It was a nice look. I thought that might have been fun, but never got around to it.
I was like a vibe as well. Great to see you, Dean. Pete, where are you today?
I'm in my study, which is a really fancy term for the spare room that we turned into a study. Probably about 2 meters away from a sleeping 1-year-old. So if I go really quiet at some point, it's because I'm terrified that I'm going to have a terrible night's sleep. It's not because I've got nervous or anything like that. But yeah, no, I'm good. Other than, chasing a small child and dog and 2 cats around, it keeps me busy for most of the day. Try and fit in a bit of work every now and again. I play a few video games when I can.
And Suzi, where are you joining us from today? Suzi's on a teeny tiny bit robotic there. but I am enjoying the plants in the background. And I'm just going to point out, everybody has their books strategically placed behind them. So hopefully Suzi's connection will sort itself out in the meantime. Now, I'm going to get the big questions out of the way. First of all, Dean, are we going to see Pickle the cat causing trouble tonight?
I can't promise you won't, because that's not how cats work, is it? You can't actually schedule their behaviour. He's not in my room right now and the door's locked, so it seems unlikely, but it hasn't stopped him before. You may hear a massive thud. You may hear a massive thud, which is at one point was him finding a moth and attacking it as it was stuck to my window. So that was fun. Yes, could happen. Could easily happen.
Pickle can definitely break into your sauna shed.
Yes, and
no
has done.
problem at all. Yeah, I think we may see Pickle. We may see Bellatrix and Faraday at some point here. And of course, Pete, you've got your zoo of children and animals as well. If we see Suzi and Iggy as well, that'll be a full house, I reckon. So let's get on with the conversation. The blurb for this talk, and I'm going to kind of read it out because I think it's a really beautiful intro into this chat. Young people are often labelled as challenging and difficult, with the blame laid at the feet of everything from drugs to video games to oversleeping and even bad parenting. So is there any truth in these generalisations? Teenagers just misunderstood. So I'm going to talk about some of the biggest factors with you all that contribute to teenage mental health and dive into the perception or perhaps the misconception versus the scientifically underpinned reality of these topics. And we're going to kick off with a big one here with Dean and parenting. So your book touches on one of the aforementioned aspects of teenage mental health. And, parenting is, let's face it, a pretty activity. What's the biggest ways that the behaviour of parents and their actions can have an impact, whether that's positive or negative, on teenagers?
Well, it's obviously, like you say, it's such a broad subject and it's such a fundamental one. It starts from day one. Obviously, your parents are your parents since you're born. That's kind of how biology works. And, they raise you. And again, it doesn't have to be your biological parents, whether it's you're raised by grandparents or, adopted parents. Your primary adult caregiver is essentially what we're talking about, because obviously families come in all shapes and sizes. But when you're a small child, you will learn most of what you learn about the world from your parents. They provide your go-to example. They provide your sense of security. You spend most of your time with them. They give you your DNA. So they shape you in very fundamental ways, and that will just keep happening until you're a teenager. And it still happens then. When you're a teenager, that's when you we start becoming an independent human rather than not subservient, that's the wrong word, but someone who cares for so it depends on their parents their parents are not so much in control. You want to be an individual at this point. And that's when, clashes can occur. That's when stresses can happen. Because parents, especially if you're the oldest sibling, they've never raised a teenager before. It's all new to them as well. And you're both finding your feet in this way. And there's lots of research about this, like certain types of parenting can have positive and negative outcomes. Like it's far too much to go into here. But I think a lot of the research has said, or at least some studies have said, that in order to maintain the most positive or the most healthy relationship between teenagers and parents, it needs to be something like an ongoing renegotiation of the relationship. You have to be able to say, well, like, you want to do this now, I'll allow that and this, that and the other. And it's both sides have to acknowledge that things are changing, but also there are limits to this. So yeah, there are so many ways in which parents can impact on a teenager's mental health and general well-being. But it's important to recognize that everyone's finding their way through this, everyone's finding their feet, and it's kind of a new situation for everyone involved. So it's a two-way street, and also it would hopefully be a joint process in finding out exactly what you should be doing, why and how, and what works for you.
Yeah, it's such a funny thing because it is one of the biggest jobs in the world. I mean, nobody ever teaches anybody how to become a parent. There's no real training manual for that, but there is a lot of kind of the kind of anecdotes that turn into sort of scientific fact that come from how people parent. So what are kind of the major kind of, are there any particular milestones or things, or particular kind of incidents growing up, rites of passage that are really kind of formative for kids in particular? What are the kind of biggest factors that shape this relationship and potentially have an impact on this idea of mental health?
Well, it's sort of a lot of studies I've seen. It's age 4 seems to be a particularly key one in terms of the stuff that happens to you. Your development at age 4 will have a bigger impact on how your development proceeds later in life. So when you're age 4, that's when things get set. If you want to look for a different, I mean, the way I've described it is until age 4, it's sort of like in terms of brain development and well-being, you're packing the car. It's a lot of work, but you're putting things in the boot, arranging the space and stuff. And age 4, that's when you set off. Like, you can't go back now. And if you've forgotten something, then you're not doomed, but it's not great. But it's kind of hard to sort of put on any one particular factor, but it's important to recognize that when you're a teenager, there will be stress in terms of dealing with your parents, and there will be, butting heads, there will be conflict, it'll just be all like a strain on the existing relationship because you're becoming a different person. Your development when you're a teenager is actually quite fundamental. Your body and brain are being overhauled at the hormonal level, at the physical level. The connections in your brain are being rewired to make you more adept for an adult existence. And that causes changes and upset and drama and things. And you will want to, your parents go from being a source of, security, caregivers, providers, to being more like wardens or like barriers to what you want to do because they have older brains, they have less flexible brains. They don't change as quickly as as they do. So it's conflict can arise from that aspect too, and it's it's important to be aware that this is a thing. I mean, it's not even a human thing. Any social species which has an adolescent stage, like chimps and rats, they show a similar thing. The adolescents become wander further and further away from the family group and explore on their own. That's a big thing. Like, you have to be able to let them do that because it's an evolved mechanism to ensure our species spreads further and wide and becomes more robust and mixes and things. And yeah, so there's so many milestones, but to point down to one thing would be tricky. But it's important to recognize this is normal. The whole classic clashing of teen versus parents, that's a normal part. We've evolved to do that, and it's only like the systems of the wider world which have led to this sort of the current sort of confusion. So yeah, so lots of milestones, lots of things, and but it's okay. It's what will happen. It'll always happen because that's how we've evolved.
So it's not such a bad thing, these teenage tantrums and things. They're normal, they're part of it, and it's just everyone establishing, I mean, I hate to use this term again, but the new normal of that time as people grow and develop. You have written in the past about some of the really big things that do play a huge part on teenage mental health. And I wanted to maybe talk about some of that. You've written an article about GCSEs and the impact that they have played on teenagers. Now, of course, we're in this strange situation this year when these kids have worked their butts off to get to this point where they're kind of ready to sit those exams. What kind of impact do you think, first off, sitting those GCSEs, what's the kind of the mental strain on a teenager, and how do you think they might be impacted this year?
It's a funny one because, like I've always said, that when you understand how the brain is being changed during adolescence, it's a lot to take in. Obviously, adolescents genuinely need more sleep at different times because of all these underlying brain changes that are occurring as part of the natural course of development. So, they need more sleep and they need to sleep later because that's just sort of biology. But they don't get to because schools start when they start and they have to go. So they don't have a choice in the matter. And also parents don't have the same sleep cycles, and then they may well end up thinking that you have to, they have to sort of go, wake up, you're missing the best part of the day, and the teens are going, and that's a valid reaction because they're not getting the sleep they need. And it's really, it's problematic. It causes a lot, not enough sleep means you lose focus, you lose the ability to remember things, you can't retain information better, you're more irritable, you can't regulate your moods as well. That's a constant default state of being for teenagers because of what we make them do. So that's actually the worst possible time to make them retain loads and loads of abstract information and then remember it on command for exams which will define the rest of their lives. It's a really big ask to ask for someone in this situation. So the stress of it alone will be quite substantial, and stress is a big underlying cause of a lot of mental health problems, particularly things like depression and anxiety. So yes, you will see spikes in that sort of thing, and teenagers do it and they get through it, and it's very impressive. So regards to them being cancelled this year or like being rescheduled for much later on, you can see that being a mixed blessing. You don't want to waste your effort. That's something we're instinctively hardwired to dislike, wasted effort. But I don't think anybody really enjoys an exam. It's like, if you told teenagers tomorrow, we're not doing exams anymore, we're doing something else entirely, a few of them would go, oh, I love exams, because nobody does. It's just it's a part that we're made to do. So I don't think it'll be necessarily a case of people will miss the exams. Then it'll be less of a stress, but then it'll bring in more uncertainty about what's going to happen and how you're going to progress and how you're going to achieve what you need to achieve to make your way in later in life. And that'll bring in more stress as a result, because the brain doesn't like uncertainty either. So it's a very, it's hard to say right now, but I can see one stress being reduced, another stress being increased. And it depends on how much, if they cancel each other out, if one outweighs the other, that's when we'll see what will really happen in the longer term.
Sure. And that's just one of the kind of major stress points that are put on teenagers at the moment. I mean, we haven't even touched on the aspect of the culture of being a teenager, of discovering different things, all these kind of interesting hobbies that they may have. One of the things that I'm kind of keen to talk about, actually, moving on to Suzi, is, of course, the impact that, drugs and other kind of factors may have on kids. So I will admit I'm quite out of my depth here in asking you about drugs. I've only ever dabbled in caffeine and alcohol and probably far too much chocolate. But even these seemingly harmless drugs can still have quite an impact on mental health. I guess my first question is it quite frustrating when people dismiss these kind of legal drugs when they could actually have a big impact on people's health?
Absolutely. I hope you guys can hear me now. I've had like 3 or 4 different laptops that I've been trying in the last 10 minutes while Dean's been talking. So fingers crossed, this is going to work now. But yeah, completely, exactly what you say, that people think, oh, alcohol's not a drug, it's a drink, like Chris Morris famously said. But really, alcohol's sort of one of the most wide-ranging has the most wide influence in the brain in terms of its effect. It has an effect on almost every neurotransmitter in the brain. It has huge physical health impacts as well, things like the liver and the circulatory system, all kinds of things. Alcohol is definitely not a sort of harmless substance. And it's one that we've got so many myths and misconceptions about. But when we're thinking about teenagers, actually, the vast majority of teenagers won't be doing anything other than drinking, maybe cigarettes or e-cigarettes as they get a bit older, potentially sort of cannabis or nitrous oxide these days, maybe. But actually, the vast majority of teenagers won't be sort of having this reckless time that they sort of get this label put on them. And actually, substance use, it does happen, absolutely, and teenagers do have this kind of proclivity to experiment and take risks and sort of push boundaries and that kind of thing. But that doesn't mean that all teenagers are sort of behind the bike sheds getting real high all the time. It's absolutely not the case at all. Sure. And yeah, I think the legal drugs in a way are the most interesting ones.
I mean, alcohol is so widely available, and as you say, it can lead to so many different things. It's kind of interesting, actually. I was wondering whether I could ask you to tell us a little bit more about maybe how habits have changed for teenagers. You wrote a journal article with Dr Pete Etchells, which discusses the changes in mental health and other behaviours over time of teenagers. So as a little kind of data quote, between 2005 and 2015, your study showed that mental health issues increased, but that trying smoking or the heavy drinking kind of decreased. Can you tell us a little bit more about the study and some of those results that you discovered?
Yeah, so we were looking in sort of UK-based 14-year-olds, so people who were 14 in 2005, and then another group of people who were 14 in 2015, and using 2 different cohort studies. So one of them is the Ausbach Children of the 90s study that's based in Bristol, and another one is the Millennium Cohort study, which is a nationwide study. So we did a bit of kind of matching. Some of the questions that they were asked were identical, which was really handy because obviously that you could just compare them directly, but we were also interested in things like sleep, and it was measured in slightly different ways in the different cohort. So we spent a while kind of harmonizing all of our variables and actually applying some matching or balancing so that the local sample was similarly representative as the national sample, so that we can actually make some comparisons rather than just saying, well, the difference is actually just that they're a different group of young people. And yeah, we found some really interesting things. So the reason we started the project is because there have been lots of reports that sort of young people were experiencing a mental health crisis at the moment. And we wanted to see, well, just what does the evidence actually look like? And I think calling it a mental health crisis is certainly overblown, but we did find that things like the number of depressive symptoms that young people were reporting, or the likelihood of self-reported self-harm behaviours and that kind of thing, had increased over that 10-year period in UK teenagers. And yeah, as you say, interestingly, things like trying different substances had gone down, and things like doing vandalism or graffiti or that kind of thing, a lot of those had gone down as well. Young people were also reporting sleeping less, so going to bed later and waking up earlier, being more likely to be overweight or obese, and being more perceiving themselves more as overweight and obese as well. And so it's really, really interesting, these changes in prevalence, but actually, what do they really tell us? What do we know about, do we know much about why this is happening? So that's what we're working on at the moment. Myself and Pravitha, we're trying to explore a bit more about how the association between these things changed as well. Because one of the things I'm interested in is, what do we know about what causes what? So does using a recreational drug, a psychoactive substance, cause an increase in the risk of poor mental health? Or are people who experience poor mental health more likely to turn to use a substance? So given we think what these things might cause the other one, the fact that one of them's going up and the other one's going down, that suggests something a bit more complicated is going on. So we're trying to kind of unpick this at the moment. And what it seems like is that though these substance use behaviours in particular are becoming less common, the extreme end are the people who are really experiencing the poor mental health. So it might be that the more kind of casual experimental use of these substances is falling away, but the people who are potentially having maladaptive relationships with these substances, that's not necessarily getting lower. It might even be increasing. We still need to explore it a bit more, but potentially that's quite worrying, that sort of the more problematic behaviours aren't going away. It's the sort of less problematic ones that are, and it's so that everything's being pushed to the extreme.
Of course, yeah. I think we live in this time where teenagers, I think kind of unfortunately get blamed or accused for lots of different behaviours, for lots of the things that we see is supposedly, down to the youth of today. And it all does seem quite unfair. We all had our time, and I loved reading Pete's book, and I related to it quite strongly, because actually from a personal perspective, I love video games. I absolutely love them. So I have kind of spent many a joyful summer of my youth kind of bouncing about Super Mario World, dressed as a plumber astride a bright green Yoshi. People, Pete, are really concerned about teenagers playing video games. This is one of the many things that they are blamed for, alongside some of the things that Suzi was mentioning earlier, which kind of seems a bit of a shame. So why are people so concerned about video games? And what is it about it? Is it the violent content? Do you think that they can influence young minds, or is it something else?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that whatever you do will have an effect on your brain, right? And there's been a lot of scaremongering around video games and technology generally over the past 10 years or so, using that as a line that, if you play video games, it changes your brain, and that's a bad thing. And it's not. If our brains didn't change, we would die, basically. And certainly wouldn't be able to learn anything. So it's the interesting thing is not how do we not whether we change, it's how do we change. The story around video games research is a really complicated one in many ways, and it's quite hard being a video games researcher, because you say that to people and they go, all right, you're playing on your Xbox in your lab, which I am, but it's for science. So there's this sort of perception that it's not a proper science, really, but at the same time, a lot of people say, video games, they're melting kids' brains, or they're the worst thing in the world. So there's a kind of disconnect between those two feelings, and I think it perhaps in part comes from the fact that a lot of people who don't play video games might not quite understand how they work, or what you're actually doing in those video game worlds. And it's understandable in a way, in that if you look at other forms of entertainment and other art forms, there's a really low barrier to entry, right? So if you have never seen a movie before, and the first movie that you go and see is rubbish, then all you need to do is just sit there while somebody else puts another DVD on, and you can try another one. You can keep trying until you maybe find something that you like Planes, Trains and Automobiles, the greatest movie ever. With video games, it's different, because if you suddenly decide that you, having never played video games before, want to, and you buy a PlayStation 4, get it out of the box, got to figure out how to plug it into the TV and how the controllers work, charge everything up, and you finally do all of that, and you turn it on. It's got to connect to the Wi-Fi, so then you've got to figure out where your Wi-Fi password is, because nobody ever remembers those. And then it connects, and then the first thing that happens is it downloads an update, and it will take like 4 hours to do that, or 27 on my Wi-Fi connection. And it kind of looks like the thing's broken, right? And it finally updates, and that's the point that you can actually put the game in and start playing something. Put the game in, another download update, so you've got to wait for that. And that's when you actually get to the point where you start playing the game. That's not the experience in and of itself, because there's a learning curve to go through, and there's a storyline to play through. And people play, I mean, obviously people play different games for different reasons, but people sometimes play the same game for lots of different reasons. And your kind of journey through a video game can differ immensely as you get better at it, as you start to understand the mechanics a little bit more, as you start to make friends in the game. And all of those sorts of things mean that there's a really high barrier to entry for understanding really what video games are. So if you don't play them, and you don't really have that sort of understanding, and you watch somebody playing a video game, it's kind of like it's a really horrible experience. Like it looks like somebody's like really glued to their screens. Like you can literally see brain juices trickling out of their ears. Is what it seems like. But that's very different to what's actually going on. So it's that disconnect, I think. Everybody's got an opinion about video games because, in part, I think they're sort of seen as this lower form of entertainment. And I think that drives a lot of the kind of public interest and the news cycle interest in video game effects. And it also drives this very binary way of thinking about whether they're all good or all bad.
It's interesting, you talked about people watching people play video games, but that is actually a huge entertainment thing for a lot of kids these days as well. I don't understand Twitch, I'm too old for that business, but I hear about it from the youth. Sounds fun. So I'm wondering then, with the video game aspect of it kind of goes synonymously with the whole worry about people being glued to screen devices. You know, everybody's, I mean, not just teenagers, everybody is kind of glued to their phones. It's a little bit like when television, I suppose, first became popular and everybody was worried about everyone being glued to the goggle box. We've moved on from that and we've relabeled it binge watching, you know, if we are genuinely glued to the TV, and we can plow through kind of box sets and things. But do you think that screens are somewhat vilified for no reason? Because I was chatting to probably a friend of all of ours, Dr. Sophie Meekings, who's another brilliant neuroscientist herself, and she suffers from hearing loss, and she was telling me last night that MSN Messenger saved her, you know, in her younger years. It enabled her to connect with people and contact people and to communicate with them. And there's also stories about people using their camera phones to zoom into menus and things. So, you know, do you think we unfairly kind of pigeonhole all screen time into one bucket of, oh no, that's absolutely awful? Or should we be a little bit more understanding, you know, for screen time being quite an asset for those perhaps suffering from sight loss or hearing loss or people that are neurodiverse? I wondered whether you can maybe tell us a little bit about your thoughts on screen time.
Yeah, I think absolutely. We often kind of apply our own viewpoint on our opinions of it. Well, we always apply our own viewpoint on our own opinions of things, but you know, thinking about how various forms of technology might affect people who are in different situations to us doesn't come easily unless you have that sort of direct experience of it. First thing to say is that screen time basically is a meaningless concept. It sounds enticing from a scientific point of view in that it's a number that you can get between 1 and 24 hours of using screens per day that you can do some stats with. But it doesn't tell you anything meaningful. It doesn't tell you what that person was doing, why they were doing it, how they were doing it, who they were doing it with. And those are the interesting questions around the effects that screens can have on us. I think that screens were vilified up until about February this year. And then everybody was put in the situation where they had to rely on them to connect with each other. And I think that perhaps one of the positives, if there are any, to come out of it at all, of this entire mess that we're in, is that people have started to appreciate this conversation that we've got around screens needs to mature, because in many ways they've saved our ability to socialize with each other. A case in point is this very thing that we're doing now. Just before the lockdown was implemented, my grandmother was on the verge of being diagnosed with dementia, and she got taken into hospital. She lives up in Manchester. It's about 5 hours in the car for us, so we don't get to see her that often. And eventually she got a place in a care home. And, you know, I'd speak to her every day not every day, so every other day on the phone when she was at home. But now, because she didn't have the internet, now in the care home, they do have the internet, and I can video call her. And when she can actually see me, I can see her, she can see her great granddaughter. And that's an incredibly wonderful thing that technology allows us to have and to do. Mm-hmm. That's not to say that it's all good or all bad. When you're talking about something as complex as human behavior and human socializing, and something as complex as the medium through which we do that, there's always going to be different stories, and some good things and some bad things. Where before February time, say, I think there was a tendency for people to see them as a very negative thing. Screen time is always bad, particularly for teenagers. And then there are a few people who said, oh, hang on a second, here's all the good things that you can do on screens. I think people are starting to appreciate that complexity a little bit more now.
So this pandemic, I suppose, thrown up some really interesting curveballs for all of your areas of research. So I want to dive into that in just a moment. Just wanted to add, if you do have any questions for our panelists, please do share them in the chat, and I will get to ask them on your behalf. So while we're hopefully hearing from our awesome audience, Pete, I just wanted to pick up on one thing. You talked about the kind of the aspect of using tech and screen time for communications. So that is a big aspect of it. What about teenagers using games and managing to socialize with people through this unprecedented, if you had unprecedented, drink, this unprecedented time that we're going through at the moment?
So this kind of goes back to that point you were making around how people view video games, right? And I think Fortnite's a really good example of this at the minute. I think a lot of kids basically use Fortnite as a glorified form of social media, or they did before the pandemic started, the lockdown started, quarantine, if anybody's got that. It looks as though it's this really horrible, violent game where you're thrown onto an island with 100 other people and you've got to be the last person surviving, which, you know, is sort of my worst nightmare. And you can play it that way if you want to, but a lot of the time people just get on there so that they can form a group with their friends and catch up after school. And they might play a few more games, or they might go into creative mode and start building forts and stuff and pushing each other off. But it's not, and this is why it's difficult to do research in this area as well, because when you start to appreciate how something as seemingly simple as Fortnite is actually lots of different things. Yes, it's a shooting game, but it's also a socializing game. It's also a collaborative building game as well. How do you pigeonhole it in research to try and understand what the effects of that game are? And I think a lot of researchers have been saying this for a long time. I think more researchers are now starting to realize this with horror, that actually you can't simplify how you categorize these sorts of games in order to understand their effects.
Wow. So staying on the topic of COVID, Suzi and Dean, I know that you've both created a bunch of resources to hopefully help people, because we don't know necessarily what the impact of this pandemic is going to have on people's mental health, but we're all in very different situations at the moment. We're all cooped up. We're not able to see the people that we love. And it's a terrifying thing that is completely out of our control. So what can people be doing to kind of check in on their mental health? And can you tell us a bit about some of the awesome resources that you've actually been kind of creating and co-creating? Suzi, can I come to you?
Yeah, so when lockdown first started, I really struggled, partly because I literally found out I was pregnant 2 weeks before. And so it was all really, really overwhelming. But also, I felt like everyone wanted to hear from epidemiologists, but I'm not the right kind of epidemiologist. I'm not an infectious diseases epidemiologist. And so, like, so many people were being accused of being armchair epidemiologists. And I was like, I am an epidemiologist, but I'm not qualified to talk about this. And I felt really like a little bit impotent. I didn't really know what to do that would be useful. And I teach on the medical degree at Liverpool Uni. And one of the things that our students, quite a lot of our students, our medical students and our nursing students, were fast tracked into the NHS. So before they actually qualified, they were sort of on COVID wards helping, well, not just helping, like doing amazing, amazing things. And we just thought, what can we do to support them? And my colleague Dr. Helen West came up with the idea of making a podcast for these students talking about mental health and well-being. So we started the Coping with COVID podcast, and each episode's about 15 minutes long, and it's evidence-based advice for how to deal with things like if you're worried about your sleep, for example. We did an episode about alcohol, if you're worried that you're drinking too much during the pandemic, which I think lots of us found that we were. Not me, obviously, because I'm not allowed at the moment. But yeah, and things like that. But also the kind of transition shock of going from being a student to suddenly having more responsibilities. And as well as that, we also were interviewing some of the students themselves, and those conversations are incredibly powerful, actually. If you're wondering what it's like to sort of be in the NHS at the moment, I would really recommend listening to what some of those nursing and medical students, and what some of them have given up to do this, sort of not being able to go and see their families and that kind of thing. One of them, genuinely, when I was editing one together, I cried because this girl was talking about missing her 21st birthday, missing being with her family because she decided to stay in Liverpool and work in the hospital. And it just made me think about when I was that age, and coming out of school or coming out of university, their life, this should be sort of opening up ahead of them, and all they're really seeing is kind of the four walls that they're in. And I know it's not for long, and I know it will pass, but when you're young, time feels different to how it does when you're older. And I can imagine that it was just incredibly tough. So it felt really good to be able to do something kind of practical and useful and use my skills in a productive way. So yeah, so that's kind of what I've been doing with my lockdown so far.
Oh, it's amazing. Because I suppose it's not just the going into lockdown and this weird situation that we don't know when it's going to end. It's also coming out of it. I mean, I know my behaviours have definitely changed. And I love, you all know, I love people. But I'm kind of running away from them screaming if I see any within my vicinity at the moment. And that's very strange. Dean, you've also created a bunch of resources that are actually available on the Shambles Network, aren't they? Can you tell us a bit about those?
I sort of thought I'd try and apply my existing knowledge to the situation to see if it would be helpful to anyone. Started a few blogs called The Pandemic Brain, because the something brain is my default way of talking about stuff. And then I did some videos. This is your brain on lockdown, which is basically looks exactly like this. I'm just wearing a different shirt each time. I filmed it right here, and just explaining to people like what's going on during, why people are reacting in certain ways to the situation of lockdown, based on what we know about the underlying neuroscience. And that's so I did a few of those. Then I had to stop because my father caught COVID and then died, and that was so if I'm trying to tweet a lot now about how to do a grief during lockdown, and when you can't actually see any of your family. It's proven scientifically interesting, if somewhat harrowing. So I'm trying to get that sort of stuff out there as well, because I'm uniquely placed to talk about that. But I've also been keeping track. I've been asked a lot about how this is impacting on teenagers, and how they should be expected to cope with it. And there have been some interesting studies, like one which show general reporting shows that levels of mental health have declined in almost every age group apart from adolescents, teenagers. And it was an interesting study, and it could be the fact that they're already kind of low, so this isn't really impacting them much more. Or it could be the case that, because now finally they don't have the traditional teenage stresses of being excluded by others, not being able to see their friends, being kept off, the internet and stuff, and not getting enough sleep because they have to go to school and exams. So maybe just the removal of the traditional teenage stresses is having a bit of a protective effect overall. I mean, it's still quite early days. We won't know for certain how this will pan out until perhaps a year down the line we can look back and see what actually happened overall. But yeah, so it's a very interesting time from a psychological perspective, and especially if you're an adolescent too. So it's obviously things are at a time of great upheaval internally, mentally, psychologically, physically. Also, the world's going through chaos as well, and maybe that could be more stressful, or it could be less, as in everything feels right now because everything's sort of synced up a bit, and there has been some theories along those lines. So yeah, so there's a lot of interesting stuff happening right now.
It's really, I mean, it is fascinating. I think if I was told I had to go back 15 years and do all that again, but in this current time, I certainly wouldn't want to do it. I feel like there's so much more going on for teenagers these days. And, it was hard enough to cope back when I did it. So I don't think I would like to do it again. But I think the other thing that you said that's really interesting is that so much of this research takes time. It's not something that you can just determine in a week or a month, like some kind of short clinical trial. These things really need to be analysed on this kind of longitudinal scale. I mean, some of the studies that Suzi's been looking at have been going on for decades and decades. And I think that's the kind of key thing here. We don't know how this might bite any of us on the bum in terms of mental health and the impact that it might have on that. So I suppose, since we're talking about teenage mental health, in your three respective areas, and I suppose given the pandemic as well, what kind of take-homes do you want people to take from this session? What do you want people to kind of remember or focus on or read up on? Let's start with you, Pete.
So I think one thing that I've noticed a lot through the pandemic is that people are worried about, especially if you've got kids of an age who are at school, how you balance that sort of need to work from home with caring responsibilities and schooling responsibilities, and I get it, right? Some people just go, just go and play. If you want to play video games, go and play video games. If you want to watch Netflix, that's fine. And there are lots of worries about, am I being a good enough parent if I do that? If what you're doing is working for you, then it's fine. Don't beat yourself up. This is not a normal situation, and it's fine actually if kids want to play video games for a bit. It's not going to ruin them. If you are worried about it, one of the best things that you can do is just have open and kind of collaborative conversations, particularly with teenagers. So there's some research from a couple of years ago that suggests that if you're trying to impose rules around tech use in the home, if you take a very authoritarian approach, say, look, you're only allowed an hour a day at this time, it's not going to work. The teens will rebel, but perhaps most worryingly, they'll hide their tech use from you. And that's the situation that you don't want to be in, is when they're doing stuff on the internet and you don't know when they're on it and what they're doing. If you take a more kind of open and collaborative approach and say, look, I would, sit down, treat them as an equal. This is how I feel about the situation. This is what I'd like you to do. How do you feel about it? They will still rebel against you because they're teens and that's what they do. But they're much less likely to hide their tech use. And that's a really good thing. Take an active interest in the sorts of games they're playing. I get this quite a lot in terms of, if you don't play video games but your kids do, how do you navigate that area? There's tons of resources out there that give parents advice on what games are age appropriate and things like that. But treat it like you would with movies. If you've got a 14-year-old, would you give them an 18 rated movie? Probably not. There are 18 rated games out there, but sometimes we don't feel as though that's the same sort of rating system as for movies. They're there for a reason though. So there's lots of information about those. Make sure they're age appropriate. Maybe read up about other sorts of games that are kind of like that 18 rated game, but rated more appropriately. So that if they say, can I play Super Death Kill Dean 57? And you go, no, that's not the right game for you. Rather than that being the end of the conversation, say, well, but how about this game instead? And it gives you an option then.
Awesome. And how about you, Dean? What do you think your main take-homes are? I mean, Pete's kind of talked about the conflict between teenager and parent or guardian, what that may be. What are your main take-homes, given the pandemic, but also kind of generally?
I think just generally, it's something like Pete so touched. It's a classic trope of parents and teens butting heads, and like, I hate you, and slamming doors and stuff. And it's almost a sitcom cliche, but it's a real thing. It happens. It's almost inevitable because of the way humans have evolved, or how we work. So even if you're a parent who's having serious trouble with your teenager, or if you're a teenager who can't understand your parent, it's normal. That is going to happen because you are operating on two different systems. Essentially, your brains are in very different places, and it's important to acknowledge that that's the thing. Like that will happen. So if your relationship is less than it was, it doesn't mean it's you've done something wrong. It doesn't mean that it's completely irreparable. It's a part of life. It'll happen. It keeps happening, and that's just how brains work. And obviously, the COVID-19 situation has obviously thrown a lot of things into sharp relief, as in when parents and teens have to share the same house a lot more, it's going to be inevitable that you're going to annoy each other a lot more because you are trapped in the same place. And that's something teenagers tend to object to anyway, because when you're at that stage of life, you need to explore more. You have an instinctive drive to broaden your horizons, to experience new things, because that's exactly what your brain wants and needs at this particular stage of development. But because that's how the world works, we don't allow them. That's not normally an option. So teenagers have all the expectations of adults and none of the rights. So we expect them to, the world is kind of unfair to teenagers. We tell them, you're not old enough to vote, you're not old enough to drive, you can't be trusted with a beer, but you must do these exams that will define your entire life from this point forward. And that seems a little inconsistent. And I think the way we talk about the whole teenage thing is something which could be improved as well. We haven't done as much today, but anytime there's a discussion about teenagers is as if they're not there, as if they haven't got the capacity to listen to this and read it themselves or see it. So a lot of people talk about teenagers as a problem, as if they're like cows on the motorway. They're just like mindless things in the way which need to be shunted to one side, and then we can all get on with our proper lives. They're not that. They are full-fledged individuals with needs and drives and desires of their own, and it should be treated as such. And I think that's probably an important thing to remember, especially during these particularly stressful and unprecedented times.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you. I kind of like that it is normal. And I can imagine teenagers and parents is one thing. If adults are struggling to live with their life partners, then no wonder teenagers and parents are going to be struggling as well. That's absolutely fair. Finally, Suzi, can I come to you? What are your main take-homes?
Yeah, to be honest, I was going to say something very, very similar to what Pete said, but about substance use rather than video games. It's exactly the same. I think lots of parents and guardians get really nervous about having the drugs conversation with their children because, firstly, I think lots of people are worried that they're going to make a fool of themselves and not know what they're talking about. But actually, that's fine, because you don't want to sort of say to your child, well, yes, I know about this drug and this drug and this drug, and obviously the sort of drugs that are popular change over time, and the ones that were popular when you were that age aren't necessarily the same ones that are around now, and won't be the same ones that are around in the future. But the key thing is to not just have the drug talk, to make it a conversation, exactly as Pete said, to listen to what your child is saying and respond to it and react to it, and create an environment where your child feels safe to come to you to say if they are concerned about themselves or about a friend, that they can talk to you about it. And creating an environment where if you don't want your child to go off and sort of smoke behind the bike sheds, then you can sort of create a home environment where they feel that they can sort of tell you about what they want to do. Because exactly as Pete said, if you create a really authoritarian environment, it will just be hidden from you what the young person is doing. And that's a much more sort of, dangerous maybe is a bit of a strong word, but risky situation to be in, particularly around these substances where when they're illicit, you run the risk of not only sort of criminal problems, but also not knowing what's in a substance means that it's much easier to take more of it than you want to, than you mean to. And I'm even with alcohol, we all know what going a bit too far feels like, and it was very easy to do, and it's still very easy to do. And that's with a substance that is meticulously regulated. We know exactly how much alcohol is in a drink that we drink, and yet still, particularly as a teenager, but I'm sure some of us have done it more recently than that, drink to the point of being sick or passing out, or all sorts of things. And that's with a substance that's really controlled. So with substances that are illicit, particularly if someone has never tried it before as well, it's so much easier to overdo it. And so sort of having conversations about that kind of moderation and starting slow and building up and that kind of thing, and not just saying all drugs are bad and all drugs are the same, because that's not a very credible argument, and it kind of it's very easy to disprove it. And all a young person needs to do is see one of their friends sort of smoking a spliff or whatever and saying that it's quite nice, and they go, oh well, if that's if that's fine, then maybe heroin is also, I mean, that's a facetious argument, but you know, if you say that all drugs are the same, then that's a leap that isn't an impossible leap to make. So I think having kind of credible conversations and a two-way dialogue is hugely important.
Yeah, completely agree. This sadly takes us to the end of our event today. So wherever you are watching from, please can you put your hands together for our speakers, Dr Dean Burnett, Dr Suzi Gage and Professor Pete Etchells. Way! Thank you all for joining us today. If you do have any questions, please tweet Cosmic Shambles or any of our guests. You can find links to all of our panelists' blogs, websites and books in the description below. Don't forget to subscribe to Cosmic Shambles YouTube channel so you don't miss out on any of the awesome upcoming live streams. Remember, Genetics Shamble is on tomorrow night live, and every Sunday at 3 p.m, Robin Ince and Helen Chesky host a live science Q&A, which this week they'll be joined by Dr. Tanner Joseph from Jodrell Bank and other special guests. If you are able to support, please go to patreon.com// Cosmic Shambles to sign up and get access to all those lovely extras. And all that's left for me to say is look after yourselves, stay safe, and we'll see you again soon. Take care. Bye.